Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 on Friday the 13th of September. My name is Brian Liddy and today I'm joined by two guests. We've got William Duguid, the writer and activist with Perth and Kinross Yes Hub, and we have Martyn Day. Martyn, you served as the SNP MP for Linlithgow and East Falkirk up until the general election just passed there. Welcome and thank you to both of you for giving up your time this evening. Thank you. I'm going to start with Ukraine update. Today is day 933 of the war in Ukraine. Ukraine accused Russia on Thursday of using strategic bombers to strike a civilian grain vessel in Black Sea waters near NATO member Romania, escalating tensions between Moscow and the military alliance. It was the first time a missile has struck a civilian vessel transporting grains at sea since the start of Moscow's invasion in February 2022. Some vessels have been damaged during Russian attacks on Ukrainian ports where they were moored. There were no casualties. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha said the strike was a brazen attack on freedom of navigation and global food security. Ukraine's Navy said Russian Tupolev Tu-22 bombers had fired a number of cruise missiles at the vessel at 11:02 local time on Wednesday. The US ambassador to Ukraine strongly condemned the attack and said Russia was responsible. A United Nations spokesperson said the incident was a stark reminder of the threats still faced in the Black Sea by civilian vessels. There was no immediate comment from Russia. Prime Minister Keir Starmer is in Washington for a strategic discussion with President Biden about Ukraine and the Middle East. The discussion is expected to include a decision to allow Ukraine to launch longer-range attacks inside Russia with partly UK-made Storm Shadow missiles. Starmer said it's very important for two key allies to discuss foreign policy questions among themselves and to have spaces to do that. Ukraine has been lobbying to use Storm Shadow and US-made ATACMS missiles for many months. Forgive me for my mispronunciation there. Starmer has told Vladimir Putin the Russian president started the war in Ukraine and could end it at any time after the Russian leader warned that any use of long-range British missiles into Russian territory would put NATO at war with his country. And Russia says its forces have recaptured 10 settlements after it launched a counter-offensive in the Kursk region to push out Ukrainian troops who stormed across the border 5 weeks ago. President Zelensky acknowledged a Russian counter-offensive had begun. More than $30 million worth of aircraft tyres made by Western manufacturers were imported into Russia last year via intermediaries, despite attempts to ban the trade, according to a Ukrainian government agency. Russian shelling on Thursday killed 3 people and injured 9 in a village in northeastern Ukraine's Kharkiv region, the regional prosecutors said. A statement said one person died of his injuries in hospital after the attack on the village of Borova, southeast of Kharkiv. Kharkiv is Ukraine's second largest city and a frequent target of Russian strikes. 100 people gathered on Thursday in the central synagogue in Kyiv to pay tribute to Matyahu Anton Sambrysky, the son of Ukraine's chief rabbi who was killed fighting Russian forces. Mourners carried flowers, touched the coffin and shook hands with the deceased's father, Chief Rabbi Moshe Azman, who was holding back tears. UK counter-terrorism police are providing support to the investigation into the death of a Daily Telegraph journalist in Gibraltar. David Knowles died while on holiday on Sunday after what his employer said was believed to be a cardiac arrest. The 32-year-old audio journalist joined the Telegraph in 2020 and was behind its Ukraine The Latest podcast. Martyn, I was going to come to you first on that. Is there anything in today's update that you'd like to highlight?
I don't think so. Anything I want to highlight other than just, as I've said every time I think I come on, how depressing the whole situation is with the whole war in Ukraine, and it just doesn't seem to be coming to an end anytime soon. It just seems to be going on, more misery and possible escalation. All very worrying, and hopefully we see a resolution, but it just isn't. It's not happening anytime soon, is it?
Yeah, thank you, Martyn. And William, what about yourself? It's hard to kind of
Well,
think of something new to say, isn't it?
it's all we search. Um, there, there's definitely the likelihood of possible escalation. That's for certain because I'm pretty sure that Keir Starmer and Joe Biden will agree to the use of the Storm Shadow missiles. And I think it's pretty likely that Ukraine will want to use them on Russia in the way that Russia have been using missiles from outside on Ukraine. I mean, all's fair in perhaps not love in this case, but war. But it is at risk of escalating the situation and getting us into a difficult position. And with other theatres of war, or at least conflict, going on in other parts of the world, it's exactly what we don't want to be seeing right now. So I don't know what the route to sorting this out and getting some sort of just peace in Ukraine is, because it seems to me that this could go on forever without anything obvious coming along. And I would like to hear more about how we're going to actually bring this to a conclusion, because, as I say, last thing we need.
Yeah, let's see if the talks between Starmer and Biden come to anything. And then now on to the equally depressing update on Israel and Gaza. At least 41,118 Palestinians have been killed and 95,125 people have been injured in Gaza since the October 7th, according to a statement from the Gaza Health Authority. Turkish officials held a brief ceremony at Istanbul International Airport today, where the body of a Turkish-American activist killed by Israeli gunfire arrived ahead of her funeral and burial in a town on the Aegean coast. Turkey announced it will conduct its own investigation into her death. Israeli security forces mischaracterized the events that led up to the fatal shooting of AG, according to an investigation by the Washington Post. The Israel Defense Forces claimed that their soldiers were targeting the leader of a violent protest when they shot her. The Director General of the World Health Organization has hailed the success of the first phase of a giant polio vaccination campaign in Gaza after more than 560,000 children received a first dose. A fresh campaign to provide a needed second dose is due to begin in about 4 weeks in Gaza. The families of Palestinians killed in an airstrike in the occupied West Bank city of Tubas held funerals today after Israeli forces withdrew following their latest raid in the territory. The 4 men buried in Tubas today were killed in an airstrike at dawn on Wednesday. A 5th fatality from the same strike was buried today in Tamun, also in the northern West Bank. Relatives of hostages in Gaza and their supporters blocked a main road in Tel Aviv, demanding a deal to release captives held by Hamas, the Times of Israel reported on Friday. Relief groups have said more than 1 million people in Gaza will not have enough food this month, while trucks loaded with fresh vegetables or meat spoil waiting to cross Israel checkpoints, and thousands of aid packages of food, medical supplies and even toothbrushes and shampoo remain stuck in a backlog of lorries unable to enter from Egypt. Israel has bombed a UN school sheltering displaced people in central Gaza, killing at least 18 people, including the shelter manager and 5 other UNRWA staff. The Al Jawni school in Nuseirat is home to about 12,000 displaced people, mostly women and children, the UN said. It's been hit 5 times since the start of the war in Gaza. Yossi Sariel, the commander of Israel's military surveillance agency, Unit 8200, has announced his resignation, publicly accepting responsibility for failings that contributed to the deadly 7th of October attacks. And President Biden and Sir Keir Starmer are meeting today to discuss the wars in Ukraine and Gaza. Starmer's government last week announced restrictions on some weapons to Israel, voicing concern that they could be used to violate international humanitarian law. Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar thanked Lebanon's Hezbollah chief Hassan Nasrallah for his support in the ongoing war with Israel in a letter released today by Hezbollah's media office. An opinion poll published today shows that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's right-wing Likud party would form the largest single party in parliament if an election were held now. The poll, published in the left-wing Mariv Daily, showed Likud winning 24 seats against 32 at present, its highest score in the Mariv poll since the 7th of October. So, Martyn, did I start with you previously? In which case, William, what would you like to say about that's a really lengthy update from Gaza today?
A lengthy and equally depressing update of a conflict that just goes on, and is a very unequal conflict. The big story of the day is clearly Israel's attack on the school, and potentially, I think, seeking by various means to close down the work of UNRWA. UNRWA has had all sorts of assaults on it over the course of this war, and initially it was trying to get countries that supported UNRWA to stop supporting UNRWA. That succeeded for a while, but didn't last. But now it looks as if they're actually just continuing with the assault through physical means. And this at a time when the aid that is supposed to be coming into Gaza is stuck. The relief agency is under assault. Okay, we've got the polio vaccines happening. I think it would have been totally unacceptable if that hadn't happened. But something really needs to give here. And I think the answer may lie with the families of the hostages, who are getting increasingly restless about the whole situation. So I think it's watch this space with that. Those are the takeaways for me.
Thank you, William. Martyn, the same question. Is there anything that you'd like to highlight?
I don't think I can add anything to it. I always think every time I hear the latest. When I visited Palestine in 2016. Before we went to Hebron, it was described as a cure for optimism. Well, I have to say that whole visit looks incredibly optimistic compared to what people are living through and dying through now. It's just absolute misery, and we're witnessing, a genocide happening before us, and it's played out on our TV screens, and the world just seems impotent to bring a halt to it.
Thank you, Martyn. So the next item is the First Minister John Swinney visited Forth Valley College today to meet representatives of the Grangemouth oil refinery workforce following confirmation by Petrinios that refinery operations will end in 2025. Joined by union representatives and members of local government, the First Minister outlined the Scottish Government's support for refinery workers and its commitment to securing a low-carbon industrial future for the site and the wider area. The Scottish and UK governments have announced a joint package of support worth £100 million, combining immediate help for affected workers with longer-term investment aimed at securing a sustainable future through the development of alternative green industries at the site and nearby. The First Minister said, "I am grateful to the members of the Grangemouth workforce and trade union representatives I met today and thank them for meeting with me at what I know is an extremely worrying time for them and their families." He went on to say this is a very disappointing decision. Both the Scottish and UK governments have repeatedly urged Petrinios to continue refining for as long as possible, and there is no doubt that this represents an economic shock. He went on to say, "We have worked very closely together to come up with a significant package that will provide immediate tailored career support for affected workers at Grangemouth Refinery, while longer-term projects get up and running on the site." He went on to say the Falkirk and Grangemouth growth deal will support the development of new industries across the region, including a bioeconomy plant, a low-carbon technology centre and an employment hub, and we are taking forward at pace the work already begun through Project Willow, which has shortlisted 3 credible potential industries. The first being low-carbon hydrogen and clean e-fuels and sustainable aviation fuels. So the first is low carbon hydrogen, the second is clean e-fuels, and the third was sustainable aviation fuels. That could be hosted on the refinery site in the future. He went on to say, "We are in intense dialogue with the trade unions. The company and Falkirk Council, and I want to reiterate my assurance that we will continue to work collaboratively with them and the UK Government to secure sustainable, skilled jobs in Grangemouth for many years to come. Martyn, would I be right in thinking that Grangemouth, the refinery, would have been part of your constituency when you were an MP?
That's correct. It was indeed. My information is now several months out of date, and it's been a fast moving pace, I believe. So, but yeah, I've got a pretty good background knowledge of the affairs, certainly up until the May announcement of the election. Very, very worrying, very disappointing. I think the writing was on the wall for a long period of time for that plant. The nature of the size, the cost of it, there's a whole factors as to why it's not particularly economically viable. However, was it time to pull the plug? And having met with the workforce, I think it could have been kept going quite a bit longer. Now the question is how much longer. There were issues with the cracker. I don't know the current position whether that's was resolved or not, because that did affect the viability of it. But the issue for me, and I suspect this will be the issue for the successor MPs that cover the area now, is that what do you do to preserve the skill base? Because it's all very well, we will have a long-term, future on the site, but you lose the skills because folk go elsewhere. So, these new jobs won't be there for a number of years. Folk have to pay mortgages, look after their families. They will go off to do other things or work in other parts of the world or the UK. So there's a real risk of losing vital skills that we need down the line. And I think, yeah, it would have been nice to have seen it running a bit longer. I know from my time, and I hope the comments that we've heard from Michelle Thompson come to fruition, that there are other outside buyers interested. There were a few people looking at possibilities back when I was an MP, but they certainly hadn't progressed to anything of a serious level at that stage. But as I say, my knowledge is unfortunately now several months out of date.
Thanks, Martyn. I mean, you mentioned Michelle Thompson, and she says that she's been in discussion with somebody that might want to buy the plant out, but she can't say anything about it because she signed a non-disclosure agreement. So, if you take that into account, does that mean then that it seems that Grangemouth is facing two potential futures, one being a new green renewable energy future, and if Michelle Thompson is correct, then the old oil and gas future?
Well, I mean, obviously, I don't know the details that Michelle has. The discussions I had with a couple of different potential interested parties never got to the stage of being asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement, but there'd be an assumption of confidentiality in that. But I think the people that I'd been speaking to were looking at something that would be viable short term, but again with a longer term transition to green. So I mean, I don't think the two futures are they're not incompatible. It's a question of the time scale of how long could something be kept going, and then at what stage do things transition? Because fossil fuels have a limited lifespan, but we still have oil production, we still have an oil need at the moment. So there is an issue of getting the balance right and making sure that we've got this section jobs available for when it shuts. And unfortunately, the speed at which this is moving suggests to me that we might not have those successor green jobs ready in time.
Okay, thanks, William. I promise I will come to you, but just because it was your constituency, Martyn. So I hear what you're saying. It's like you're thinking about jobs in the short term before the renewable energy option can be built, I expect. But out of the two, I mean, which would you rather see in the long term? Would you?
The long term, there's no debate. It's a green future. I mean, it has to be, and it has to be a sustainable one. So the long term is relatively straightforward. The short term is here and now, and we still have the old tech, and it's how you bridge the gap between the two. It's how quickly that happens, and I think that's the rock and the hard place that we're in just now. It's happening too quickly to secure the jobs and the skills. And in my opinion, that's my knowledge of it at the moment. So I think, yeah, we do need to do something to try and protect them. But it's a private firm. It's made a commercial decision based on its balance book, and it's not necessarily one that benefits the community.
Okay, thank you. William, over to you.
Okay. Well, for me, the big picture is that just transition or no, right now, Scotland has over 90% of the UK oil production and no refinery very shortly. Whereas England, with less than 10% of UK oil production, I think has half a dozen still. And I think this is part of the progressive hobbling of the Scottish economy. Retaining the skills is the big issue, because if we can't get something viable out of Grangemouth going forward, at least not for a wee while, then it's another it's another weakness we have to put up with for the day we actually become independent. And in that context, the Scottish Government's Green Industrial Strategy was published on Wednesday, and then the events of the very next day demonstrated that the whole idea of the Scottish Government having an industrial strategy is a nonsense, because things are just out of their control. It's a no-win situation they're in if they're trying to transform the economy. And it's always, always for the Scottish Government responsibility without authority. That's why we need independence, and we need it as soon as possible, in my view.
Martyn, staying with us for a wee bit longer, this came up at this week's First Minister's questions. I don't know if you managed to see it, but the First Minister agreed with Douglas Ross that the closure of Grangemouth would be a devastating blow to the local workforce. But Jackie Baillie, who stood in for Anna Sarwar at FMQs, she also focused on Grangemouth, and she said both governments have to work together to meet the needs of the workforce. But she spun it in a very particular way. She strongly implied that Grangemouth had only recently become an imperative for Westminster when Keir Starmer spoke to John Swinney, and she implied that he had just recently grasped the nettle or seized the initiative. And she said that when Starmer brought it up with Mr. Swinney, but prior to that, Mr. Swinney had implied the opposite, that he brought it up when he spoke to Starmer. And when Swinney rejoindered with that, he said, to be fair, the previous Tory government had frequently also discussed the plans for Grangemouth. So I don't know if is this a sign that maybe we're not going to be able to trust Labour on big issues like this?
Well, I think everything we've seen from Labour in their first matter of weeks in government suggests that they should not be trusted, from not dealing with the two-child cap to the winter fuel issues to the betrayal of WASPy women. There's no solution there. I don't think we can trust them on anything. So certainly industrial strategy is just yet another plank in that arsenal, I'm afraid. As to who raised what, the issue is, can we get some sort of solution? Because, we're talking 400 sort of jobs at the moment directly, and then most rules of thumb say that you look at perhaps as much as 7 times that direct number of jobs for the indirect number of jobs affected. So, it's a pretty major blow about to hit the local economy. So it definitely needs a major strategy. And to that extent, not often I say anything even remotely agreeing with Jackie Baillie, but yeah, we will need both governments working together, because the reality is Westminster has many of the reserved powers that we should have in Scotland, but we don't have. So we do need both governments.
And again, just staying with you, Martyn, I will come back to you again, William, I promise. But it said in the report that £100 million has been put on the table to invest there. Is that going to be enough?
I don't know. It depends what's done and what the outcomes are, and without that bit of information, is it going to be enough? It's a pretty major blow to the local economy, so we certainly need something.
Okay, thanks, Martyn. William, is there anything that you'd like to add before we move on?
Not particularly, except that I think the early signs are that the working together of the Scottish Government and the UK Government under Labour is no better, no more cooperative, no more positive than it was with the Conservatives. It's just the same, and it's unsatisfactory. We do need the governments working together properly, and I do lay the main blame for them not doing so with Westminster in this regard. We are always the second priority. Again, that's why we need independence, but right now we need better worked devolution. so that things like this can be approached in a genuinely collegiate basis.
Okay, thank you, William. So the UK's first new deep coal mine in 30 years will not be allowed to go ahead after a ruling in the High Court. This morning, Justice Holgate ruled that plans to build the facility in Whitehaven, Cumbria, would not proceed in what campaigners called a victory for the environment. New fossil fuel projects are now considered to be on shakier legal ground after the precedent set by the landmark Supreme Court decision that quashed planning permission granted for an oil drilling well at Horse Hill on the Wealden, Surrey. The judgment found the climate impact of burning coal, oil and gas must be taken into account when deciding whether to approve projects. This was the first court decision on plans for a new fossil fuel development since the Horse Hill ruling. Justice Holgate agreed with Friends of the Earth that the then Secretary of State for Levelling Up, Michael Gove, had acted unlawfully in accepting a claim by West Cumbria Mining that the mine would be net zero and have no impact on the UK's ability to meet the emissions cut required under the Climate Change Act 2008, because it was relying on offsetting through purchasing carbon credits from abroad. UK government policy does not allow for reliance on international offset to meet carbon budgets. When it came into power in July, the new Labour government withdrew its support from the Whitehaven mine in the Cumbria legal case. Lawyers acting for Angela Rayner, the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government, said there had been an error in law in the decision to grant planning permission for the mine in December 2022. Withdrawing its defence against two legal challenges by Friends of the Earth and South Lake's Action on Climate Change, the government instead informed the court that the planning permission should be quashed. The case proceeded as the developer of the mine, WCM, still wanted to defend the original decision to approve it. So, turn some notes. So we're giving some context there about how Michael Gove had claimed that the new mine would be net zero because it would save having to import foreign fuel. And then the new Labour government withdrew support for the mine and let the Tory plan fall in court. William, I was just thinking, is this an approach that Starmer's Labour government should be taking more often in Westminster, do you think?
I think they should be considering everything on its own merits rather than just doing what the Tories did. So I'm actually with them on this one. The legal basis for Gove agreeing to the deep coal mine was erroneous because, as you say, it relied on offsetting with carbon credits from abroad, which actual government policy said you couldn't do. So Labour was quite right to withdraw their support on that basis. West Cumbria Mines continued with the attempt to get the decision reversed. But I think it all goes into the mix of the overall climate position. I do not see why the UK requires another coal mine, to be quite honest with you. You need to take account of the climate impacts. Coal's not needed. And I think it actually probably does the UK's reputation a wee bit of harm as well. So if I would be quite happy for Labour to keep up with this, taking everything on its merits thing and coming up with the right decisions occasionally. So, okay, hats off to them on this one.
Thank you, William. Martyn, I'm just wondering if you were maybe in the chamber when Michael Gove was making those kind of statements about new coal mines being, or new oil wells being net zero.
I wasn't. I would certainly have remembered him saying something of that nature. It's just, their attempt at greenwashing has been exposed, and I'm glad that the correct legal outcome has been seen. It's a bit of good news for a change, which is positive to hear, and hopefully we hear more good news going forward. We need to move, away from such fossil fuel approaches. So it's, England's been over-dependent on fossil fuel power stations and for far too long, and that's partly why the UK's energy strategy has been in a mess. So hopefully that's a sign, a glimmer of hope that things might start moving in the right direction there.
Thank you, Martyn. The UK government has agreed to take control of the National Grid unit tasked with keeping the lights on in a £630 million deal that takes effect from next month. The UK's Electric System Operator, or ESO, will be transferred into public ownership to create a new National Energy System Operator called NESO, which will also oversee the gas system. The government hopes that by bringing together the separate units involved in planning the UK's electricity and gas networks under one publicly owned company, the system operator can adopt a more strategic approach to achieving a net zero energy system by 2030. Ed Miliband, the Energy Secretary, said NESO would have a huge role to play in delivering our mission to make Britain a clean energy superpower by providing impartial whole system expertise on building a network that is fit for the future. NESO is expected to work alongside GB Energy, the public company set up by Labour to invest in low carbon energy and to help connect new generation projects with the electricity grid. The decision to remove the ESO from National Grid's ownership was made under the previous Conservative government because of concerns over a conflict of interest relating to the operator's role providing strategic advice to government officials. The deal was expected to take place in July this year, but it was delayed until the 1st of October because of the general election. So our piece described this as a more strategic approach to achieving a net zero energy system by 2030. Martyn, I'm wondering, do you think, will this also mean a better deal for those parts of Scotland that are energy rich but are forced to pay the highest energy charges in Europe? There's that saying, how does it go? We have the energy but lack the power. Is this going to make any difference?
I think we have to wait and see. I mean, many of the public probably are not aware that the National Grid is a privately run company. So seeing something taken away from that in public hands is a general move in the right direction. But in my opinion, the whole grid system should be in public ownership. And I think what would really benefit us better, and I've called for this for a number of years now, is we should have our own ScotGrid. We should have our own system because that would get around the issues of unfair energy transmission charges, and it would allow us to create our own network and infrastructure. So I think it is a move in the right direction, but I would like to see a lot more, and I'd like to see a particular Scottish angle to it.
Thank you, Martyn. William, how do you see this then? Is this going to help energy bills come down in the north of Scotland?
There's no particular evidence that it will any more than it will anywhere else. Ed Miliband has promised some jam tomorrow. It'll make bills less in the long run, he says. Now, bearing in mind that the electricity market right now is effectively a big con trick, if they had the political will, they could make them cheaper right flaming now. And certainly they could do something to make them a bit fairer, whether that's the ScotGrid or not. It is ludicrous that the place that is responsible for generating the vast majority of that electricity is the one where transmission charges are the highest, firstly, and secondly, the price paid by consumers are the highest, in a place which is likely to be significantly colder than the south of the UK. So I think it's very much a wait and see, and so often with Labour it is a wait and see. It's ostensibly a good thing, but it is jam tomorrow and we should be having jam today, perhaps.
Okay, jam all round then. Thank you, William. Downing Street has said that the UK government did not carry out a specific impact assessment on the withdrawal of the winter fuel payment from the bulk of pensioners, such as the potential effect on illness and death rates among older people. After days of Number 10 refusing to comment, Sir Keir Starmer's deputy spokesperson said the only assessment made before the policy announcement was a standard legal one of potential equalities impacts. Asked to confirm that there had been no wider assessment to try to establish how many affected pensioners may face health vulnerabilities and could thus be at risk, she said that's right. Speaking later to reporters en route to Washington, Starmer confirmed this. Commenting, SNP health spokesperson at Westminster Seamus Logan MP said, "The Labour government must urgently clarify if Wes Streeting's shock admission is true. that it didn't even bother to carry out a health impact assessment of the winter fuel payment cuts to pensioners. He went on to say the Labour Party's own research suggests around 4,000 pensioners could die as a result of its cuts. If no official assessment was carried out, it is a shocking dereliction of duty and makes it even more important that Keir Starmer urgently U-turns on these damaging and deeply unpopular Labour Party cuts. He went on to say SNP MPs voted against the cuts, which will hit around 860,000 Scottish pensioners and slash Scotland's budget by more than £1 million. £100 million, forgive me. It was appalling that not a single Scottish Labour MP joined us. Surely now they must call back. They must back calls for an immediate U-turn. So, Martyn, how big a headache do you think this scrapping of the winter fuel payments is going to be for Starmer? And again, I'm wondering, as you may well have been in the chamber when some of those votes were being mentioned in the piece there.
I mean, the stark reality is he has an absolute super majority in the House of Commons, and as we saw by how relatively minor the rebellion was, and this has been touted as the biggest rebellion that he's faced given the number of abstentions, he can act with impunity, and that is the sad reality. So it's not going to be a massive headache for him in terms of getting his legislation through. What will be more interesting, I think, is whether it has a longer term damage to his standing in the opinion polls. He is, at the end of the day, another populist, so he'll be keeping an eye on how that looks and what his chances are for a re-election, because his supermajority is based on a very fragile share of the UK vote, 34%. And the reality is, as we know, the Tories and Reform had a bigger combined share, so if the right gets its act together, he's in for trouble, and we need to get our act together here in Scotland to pressure him from a more social democratic background. So yes, that's where the headache will come from, and these issues will not play well with the public. The reality is, Labour's own research saying that 4,000 pensioners could die as a result. A lot more will be pushed further into poverty and into poorer health, which will weaken their life chances. I mentioned, floated this idea a number of times when I was in Parliament. If we had all the powers of both of energy and as well as the health ones, you could look at doing things like prescribing heating, because so many health conditions could be helped by people living in adequately heated homes. We need to be looking out of the box. But, the winter fuel benefit was a small modicum in the right direction. It disproportionately benefited people in Scotland where the climate is poorer. But now that's been taken away. And I think one of the lessons that people in Scotland need to see, and not just pensioners, is, England decides what its policies are going to be. It removed the winter fuel payment and at a stroke, because consequentials have consequences, knocked 160 million out of the Scottish budget for future years. So that we've got to get these messages across to people that is how decisions are made, and it's not fit for purpose.
Thanks, Martyn. And when you say energy could be prescribed, do you mean the same way that you would prescribe antibiotics or something like that? Or?
That's always been my view for a number of years. Smart meters aren't quite smart enough, but I could see a future where your GP could see that an elderly person that needed to have a bit more heat wasn't adequately heating their home and should be able to prescribe that. We've got to look down the line and come up with something radical and different for the future. Now, we don't have the powers to do that, and we don't have the budget with the limited resources that we have at the moment. But we need to be looking at a future down the line that is about a well-being economy and protects everybody. So we need to think differently.
And that would do away with the heat banks that we had last year. Williams, Martyn was pointing out that it's not going to be a headache for Starmer in Parliament because he's got a big majority, but he's not doing well in the popularity polls, is he? Is that going to be more of a headache for him?
Well, the optics are terrible for Labour, and I think it will, in the long term, affect him in the opinion polls. But I mean, he would argue that he's still got time to get round that. It was just, I think, a very strange thing to go for in the early days of having apparently discovered that there was a black hole. Finally, when they'd been told by the SNP beforehand that there would be a black hole, but never mind. When they finally discovered it, this was what they fastened on. And it would be quite interesting to see what Rachel Reeves does over the next few months in terms of maybe rectifying some of that, perhaps by, I don't know, using taxation or something like that. In Scotland, the challenge is for certainly the SNP government and also those who support the very idea of independence to make it absolutely crystal clear that this is not the Scottish Government's fault, but it is Labour's fault. And all the promises that were made by Labour MPs elected in Scotland and all the statements they made have turned out to be complete sham. But there will be a significant attempt by certain broadcasters, shall we say, to portray Labour as the good guys in this and the SNP as the bad guys. And that has to be resisted, I think.
It's not just in the media, though, William, is it? I've seen those kinds of characterisations being put to John Spinney in Holyrood. Both Labour and the Tories in Holyrood I've heard saying that this is the SNP's fault and not Westminster's fault. I don't know, Martyn, maybe do you want to say something about that before we move on?
I mean, it's classic gaslighting, isn't it? You know, the Westminster makes a decision. The knock-on effect is they take 160 million away from Scotland, and it's the Scottish Parliament's fault for not being able to do even more with considerably less money. It just doesn't stack up. And you know, if any right-minded person looks at it, they'll come to that conclusion. The problem is, a lot of the public have very short attention spans, don't really look at the facts and just hear sound bites. And the mainstream media and have been in the cheerleading for Labour and the Tories, and you know, they get misled. So we've got a massive public education job to do to make sure people understand just how the broken system of Britain actually works, or doesn't work, which is the point we want to get across.
Okay, thank you, Martyn. So the UK government is drawing up plans to ban junk food ads and to stop children buying high caffeine energy drinks as part of a raft of public health measures aimed at preventing illness and easing pressure on the NHS. So Keir Starmer has said he will face down the predictable cries of nanny state because he is convinced this is the way to fix the NHS. The UK government announced that junk food advertisements will be banned from television before the 9 p.m. watershed, and online ads for products that are high in fat, salt and sugar will be banned altogether. Both measures, which are intended to help tackle childhood obesity, will come into force in a year's time. Plans to ban children from buying high caffeine energy drinks, which form part of the same public health drive and appeared in Labour's election manifesto, are expected to be announced next month. In the coming months, the UK government plans to introduce a strengthened tobacco and vapes bill, which is likely to extend the indoor smoking ban to pub beer gardens. Westminster is looking at expanding water fluoridation to improve dental health and giving councils in England enhanced powers to block the development of fast food outlets near schools to tackle obesity. Further measures are being looked at, with government officials canvassing the public health sector for policy ideas. This announcement comes 2 days after the publication of a major inquiry found the health service was in critical condition. The Prime Minister said he was prepared to take controversial action to fix the NHS and public health in England after the findings by the cancer surgeon and former Minister Ara Darzi. In a speech at the King's Fund, Sir Keir Starmer said he intended to perform major surgery, not sticking plasters, on the NHS and take much bolder measures to prevent illness. He said the NHS had to reform or die, and it would take 10 years to implement the changes needed. We need to have the courage to deliver long-term reform. Major surgery, not sticking plasters. We've got to face up to the challenges, ageing society, a higher burden of disease, he said. The Darzi report concluded that years of neglect by previous governments had left the NHS in critical condition and unable to give patients the timely care they needed amid an explosion in demand caused by an ageing, growing and increasingly sick population. Funding for the NHS in Scotland has been directly affected by reduced Barnett consequential caused by UK austerity underfunding the NHS in England. So, William, I've already seen Starmer's prediction come true. The headline in the Scottish Daily Mail today referred to Starmer as a nanny. And do you think, is that a fair characterisation?
Well, governments have been doing things to try and improve the health of the nation by means of prevention for years and years and years, and it's always characterised as nanny state. It's a perfectly valid option if the NHS is in crisis. I mean, okay, it's interesting that it's down to the NHS to reform rather than down to the government to fund it properly, but that's another matter. It's a perfectly valid thing to do to try and prevent things more than having to treat them at the time. It's actually clearly a less expensive option, and when obviously the trajectory of the need for funds in the NHS is going to go up, not just because of the population aging and necessarily getting sicker, but because more becomes possible as science moves on. So I don't have a real problem with this at all, and I certainly don't characterise it as nanny state. That's what's always said, and then it's accepted, and the next thing becomes the nanny state thing, and so the process goes on.
Yes, and you're making me think, William, of well, Martyn. Do you remember when people used to smoke on buses? You're probably not as old as me, so maybe you don't remember. But
Buses, offices, pubs everywhere. Yes.
yeah, and I remember when smokers were banned to sit upstairs on the bus. They weren't allowed to smoke downstairs. And I remember thinking, that's never going to happen. That's never going to happen. And yet, look where we are now. So do you think this is going to take the same path eventually?
I mean, the future's not written. I think it's a step in the right direction. So credit where it's due. I think I would welcome the ban. If we look at the UK has Europe's highest consumption of ultra-processed foods, and Scotland has the worst record within the UK for that. So it's definitely of benefit. But hand in hand with that, I think you also have to educate people as to how they can eat healthier and how they can prepare basic meals, because I think we have problems that contribute to people going for the easy options, which aren't necessarily the healthiest. So that's one strand of my thinking. The other strand of my thinking is that I'm just worried at how things are being framed, that, there's a problem with the health service, therefore, this is alludes to the opening the door to privatisation that we heard Labour touting before the election. And I think it'll all pass will lead down that route, that we see a very dangerous path ahead of us if we don't forewarn and try and stall it.
Okay, thank you, Martyn. Journalists from more than a dozen media outlets in Hong Kong have been harassed and targeted in what the city's largest journalist association said was a systemic and organised attack over recent months. The harassment included death threats and threatening and defamatory complaint letters being sent to reporters' families and their employers, as well as landlords and neighbours, the Hong Kong Journalists Association, the HKJA, said. Selina Cheng, the chair of the HKJA, told a press conference today that the association had observed a severe wave of trolling and harassment between June and August, including emails and letters sent to workplaces, social media accounts and home addresses. The letters threatened people's personal safety, connections and employment. Some had been pressured to give up their profession or union positions, she said. Employees from at least 15 international and local outlets, including Hong Kong Free Press, In Media and Hong Kong Feature were targeted, along with the members of the HKJA Executive Committee and journalistic education institutions. Cheng said it appeared the harassment was aimed at journalists as a community rather than specific individuals. Some recipients were told they could be breaching national security laws by continuing to associate with the journalists. Letters sent to smaller organisations resembled ransom letters, while other messages including threatening motifs and pictures or personal information posted to Wikipedia. HKJA said it was concerned about how personal information and addresses had been obtained. Since the government's crackdown on Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement and the introduction of the national security law, the city's once free media has become increasingly constrained. Journalists have come under increasing pressure, with major outlets such as Apple Daily and Stand News forced to close, journalists and editors prosecuted, and visas denied to foreign reporters. Anonymous letters have been sent to the landlord of the HKFP's director and editor-in-chief Tom Grundy last week, containing defamatory claims, falsities, and threats of unimaginable consequences and collateral damage unless he was evicted from the property and district. The landlord ignored the threats, and Grundy reported the threats to police, the third time that the HKFP had had to make police reports related to harassment and intimidation in recent years. Just by the way, the journalist Selina Cheng recently covered the war crime commemorations in Sarajevo. I think I'm right in saying. But William, I don't really have a question. Oh, sorry, it wasn't Selina Cheng, it was Grundy who was covering Sarajevo recently. My apologies. William, I don't really have a question on this, but how journalists are treated, especially in countries like Russia and China, or in war zones like Ukraine and Gaza, have been getting a much higher profile in the past few years, and now it seems we've added Hong Kong to the list.
Well, Hong Kong was always a candidate to be on the list. This is how the big powers operate in various different ways. I mean, the US does things differently, but in some ways, they've all got their issues, don't they? Russia is certainly fairly repressive. China, who sometimes gets a reputation for sort of standing on the sidelines and not throwing its weight about, but it does throw its weight about with dissidents. And obviously, these Hong Kong journalists wanting no more than to be able to report the truth as they used to be able to do, they're seen as dissidents. And some of the Stand News journalists just the other week were charged with sedition, an old law that actually was created under British colonial rule, but actually seldom used, except probably for actual sedition. But now journalists doing their job is sedition, and that's something to be resisted. I mean, I'm always being very uncomplimentary about Scottish journalism, and rightly so, because the general standard is terrible. But I certainly believe that journalistic freedom and the freedom to do journalism properly is an absolutely crucial thing that we need to preserve.
Thank you, William. Martyn, have you anything to say on this?
Not really. I don't think we should be surprised with what we've heard there. It was probably within sort of year and a half, 2 years. I remember speaking in Parliament about the bounties that had been issued on dissidents that were in exile abroad. You know, freedom of expression and thought are not tolerated there, and we're just seeing another manifestation of it. I think it's remarkable courage that these journalists put up actually to try and expose the truth and to operate against such an oppressive regime. So full strength to them. If only more of our journalists had some of that courage as well. You know.
Maybe it'll come in time. People who are disabled or have long-term health conditions are to be offered support from a dedicated employability advisor if they require help to find work. This new Scottish Government initiative will be in place by next summer and will involve advisors working with employers to develop roles suited to an individual's needs. This was included in last week's programme for government and is designed to support people into work and help to increase Scotland's workforce, which will help to boost the country's economic growth. It will also help to deliver the Scottish Government's ambition of creating a fairer labour market and halving the disability employment gap by 2038. The Scottish Government will partner with local authorities and others, including health and voluntary organisations, to implement the measures. They build on the existing No One Left Behind approach, which has supported 61,930 people since April 2019, 19% of whom have reported having a disability. Employment Minister Tom Arthur visited the Routes to Work South Cook and Learn Cafe in Cambuslang to find out how people facing challenges in getting back to work are currently being helped. Mr Arthur said, "Our commitment to deliver specialist employability support from summer 2025 will ensure that more disabled people are able to secure fulfilling jobs." He went on to say tackling discrimination and stigma faced by those with disabilities and long-term health conditions is key to building a diverse workforce and creating a more prosperous and resilient economy. He He went on to say, the project that I am visiting today demonstrates how supporting those furthest away from employment into work helps us to address labour market inequality and provide people with a better quality of life. So, Martyn, I'm thinking this isn't the same as the previous Tory government suggestion that people with disabilities should be forced into employment, get them back into the workforce instead of being benefit junkies. This is different, isn't it?
It certainly appears to be much more about trying to create a level playing field and support people. There's no reason why disabled workers aren't fantastic workers, and they are. Sometimes they need aids and adaptations, and it's about making sure they have the support and that they get the encouragement. And yeah, I think it's a wonderful initiative. Let's hope we see a lot more of it.
Thanks, Martyn. William, do you think the same as me, that this is another one of the differences between the Holyrood and Westminster governments?
Yeah, you could certainly argue that. This is a good programme. I like the title, No One Left Behind. Very good. And obviously it's a rolling programme. This is just part of it. This current iteration of it will go until 2027. I like the fact that it isn't about forcing people to do things, but talking to employers to help them to find roles suited to an individual's needs. So it does focus on the actual people with the disabilities rather than trying to straitjacket them. So I think an unvarnished good thing, and something we should be hearing more about in the mainstream press. But we'll settle for Broadcasting Scotland for now.
Yes, thank you. It's another, as you say, it's another reason why people should come here for their news. I would absolutely endorse that. Thank you, William. Our last item is Pitlochry Festival Theatre have announced the appointment of actor, singer, writer, producer and director Alan Cumming will be their new artistic director. Cumming made his professional theatre debut at the Tron Theatre in Glasgow 40 years ago. 30 years ago, his Hamlet stormed the West End and he was hailed as an actor knocking at the door of greatness. A quarter of a century ago, he was a sensation as Cabaret's Master of Ceremonies in a production that forever changed the Broadway landscape. A decade ago, his visceral, virtually one-man Macbeth was a stunning transatlantic coup de théâtre. His screen work ranges from art house to blockbuster cult to mainstream. And speaking of his appointment, Alan Cumming said, "For me, all roads lead to the theatre and all roads lead to Scotland. I am a theatre animal at heart and, like Robert Burns, my heart is in the Highlands. To become Pitlochry Festival Theatre's artistic director is a homecoming I embrace with all of my experience, all my passion and, yes, all my heart." Alan Cumming will join Pitlochry Festival Theatre as artistic director from January 2025 with his programme season beginning in 2026. William, I'm kind of shocked that our piece didn't mention his role in Victor and Barry. What was it they called themselves? Kelvin's side. But Cummings made another quote, which again we didn't use. It said, "I cannot wait to share Pitlochry with the world and the world with Pitlochry," which has a nice ring to it. But do you think he's got the qualifications?
Well, he's got the experience. I mean, my first sight of Alan Cumming, of course, was as Sebastian Flyte in The High Life, a comedy whose life was regrettably short because I enjoyed it and have watched it several times since. And I wasn't aware at that time of just what a pedigree Alan Cumming has got on the stage. So he's bringing that experience to it. He's been through an extensive 3-month selection process. It was a surprise that he applied, but I'd be very interested to see what he does with it. I think Pitlochry is a hidden gem, and if he can help to unhide it, that's great. So all for this one, and let's see what happens.
I remember The High Life fondly as well. I was living in England at the time and would watch it with my flatmates, and they wouldn't get jokes about. There was one episode that had a running gag about tablet, which nobody understood. Martyn, I don't know, are you a fan of The High Life? Do you think he's qualified?
I think he probably, yes, is qualified, and I know who he is and I know where Pitlochry is, but I didn't know they had a festival theatre, so I'm showing my own ignorance here. I'll need to check this out now. Be on a voyage of discovery myself.
Okay, and I think you've inspired me, William. I'm going to go home and watch some of The High Life tonight, I think, after this. Thank you, both of you, for, again, as I'll often say, for giving up some of your evening here. I really appreciate it. It's our time for our usual reminder that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please do consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. Right now, we urgently need to increase our donations if we are to be able to pay our bills. We face costs of over £4,000 every month, but our income is just over £2,000 a month, and we are now facing mounting debts. Please donate whatever you can afford. So thank you once again to Martyn Day and to William Duguid. Really appreciate your thoughts and your input. And we'll say goodbye. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you on Sunday for the full Scottish. Goodbye.